Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insights from across disciplines. You can be a part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collections held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Lysley Tenorio. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce Mildred Londa Weisman Fellow Lysley Tenorio. Lysley Tenorio is a fiction writer whose work aims to expand how the Filipino narrative is represented in contemporary fiction. Most recently, he is the author of the novel The Son of Good Fortune, published by HarperCollins in 2020. The novel follows the story of Excel, an undocumented Filipino teenager who is navigating his relationship with his mother, an uncertain future, and life in the United States. The book won the 2020 New American Voices Award from the Institute for Immigration Research and is being developed into a comedy series by Riz Ahmed and Lulu Wang for Amazon. He's also the author of the story collection Monstress, published by HarperCollins. Monstress contain unique stories set amongst Filipino communities of California and the Philippines. The collection was named a Book of the Year by the San Francisco Chronicle. The American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, the Mai Theater Company in New York City, have adapted some of Professor Tenorio's stories from the stage. While at Radcliffe, Professor Tenorio is working on his next novel, The Children Go. Inspired by the Overseas Filipino Workers, OFW, phenomenon, the novel focuses on Faustina Go, an elderly woman in the Philippines whose 7 children work as OFWs across the globe, one on each continent. Faustina hopes for her children to be reunited and return to the Philippines one last time before she dies. The novel explores elements of the OFW experience against the setting of various countries and cultures, and considers the questions of what it means to be Filipino in the world. Professor Tenorio received his MFA at the University of Oregon. He has been the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Stagner Fellowship at Stanford University, a National Endowment of the Arts Literature Fellowship, the Pushcart Prize, the Whiting Award, and the Joseph Brodsky Rome Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His residencies have included the James Merrill House, McDowell, Yaddo, and the Bogliasco Foundation. His stories have been featured in The Atlantic, Plowshares, and Zoetrope, Old Story. Professor Tenorio was a 2021 finalist for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize and was recently awarded the 2022 Guggenheim Fellowship in Fiction. He is a professor at St. Mary's College in California and lives in San Francisco. It is my real pleasure to give the floor to Lysley Tenorio.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that generous introduction. And thank you everyone out there in Zoom land for tuning in. I know that we spend a lot of time on Zoom these days, so I appreciate you making the time to listen. Before I start the talk, I'd like to share some thank yous, of course. First of all, thank you so much to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for the gift of the Mildred Londa Weisman Fellowship. This fellowship and the time here really has been one of the great privileges of my writing life, and I will be forever grateful. I want to thank the staff at Radcliffe and the staff at the Brattle Street Apartments. We're still in the midst of a pandemic, and I appreciate all your efforts to bring us together and to keep us safe and comfortable so that we can pursue and focus on our work. A special thank you to the members of the Cambridge chapter of MIG. Their commitment to our work is vital, and I look forward to continuing that work in the years to come. And finally, of course, thank you to my fellow fellows. To be among this group of scholars, scientists, practitioners, and artists, to learn from their expertise has been an incredible honor, and the real gift has been their friendship. I'm really going to miss you guys when all this is over. In terms of what I'm going to cover today, I thought I'd begin by giving just an overview of my work, talking briefly about how and why I write what I write. I'll then discuss a little bit of my project, which I'm working on here at Radcliffe, which is still very much in its early stages. And I'll talk a little bit about the book itself. And then I'll conclude by reading an excerpt from my novel, The Son of Good Fortune, which came out in 2020. And hopefully after that, we can have a fun conversation and hopefully get some good questions. So whenever I give talks or readings, I'm often asked, what does one need to become a writer? And I usually give the same answer. I think a writer, or really any artist, in order to get to work, needs a sense of obsession. And what I mean by that is a particular question or concern or sense of urgency that really gnaws at your brain and your heart and motivates you to get to the page, to the screen, to the canvas. I'll show you what my obsession is. This is the source of my obsession. So this here is a picture of my mother and my 4 siblings and me. I am the one here in the corner. My partner likes to say that this picture sort of embodies my soul, this look of fright mixed with a sense of grumpiness or feeling disgruntled. But whenever I look at this picture, I find myself constantly questioning and wondering just the nature of this moment. This picture was taken soon after we arrived in America from the Philippines. I'm told that these photos were taken for our green cards so that we could continue on our way towards citizenship. And I think what haunts me about this photo is this, well, for one, just the quality and the clarity of the photos themselves, and this kind of strange blank expression that seems to be on all our faces. It is a look of, uncertainty. It's a sign of, the sense of having come from some other place and not really knowing what's ahead. And I think that question that I see in all our faces, that's really become the inspiration for my work. All I know about this moment here is based on hearsay and speculation. There's really no way for me to know what we were experiencing or wondering at the time. As you can see, I was far too young to have a sense of what was really happening. And yet I'm convinced that this moment is really what defines so much of my life and really what motivates me to pursue fiction and to really dive into this question of immigration, this act of leaving one place for another, and all the gains and losses in that endeavor. So let's see. Oops, back. Oops. All right. That question is what really motivated me to begin writing fiction in the first place. And that eventually led to my first book, the story collection Monstress. Here on the screen, you see 2 covers. One is the original issue, the one on the left, and the second one is the reissue that came out in 2020. For the reissue, my publisher asked me to write a preface for the book. And I was happy to do it, though admittedly, it's a strange thing to write for a writer to write about one's own work. And even though it was just a brief essay at the beginning, it took me a long time to figure out, and it took me a long time to figure out what it was I really was trying to say about the book as a whole. So what I thought I would do, just to give you a sense of, again, my obsession and inspiration for my work, I thought I would read some of that preface, and hopefully you get a sense of how my brain operates and what's really going on behind these words. So I'm going to read from the introduction. Once in first grade, we played pantomime. The game was simple. To play, you acted out a gesture or action that the class would have to guess. It was my turn. I stood up in front of the class, then bent at the knees and pretended to lift a heavy object in each hand. I stepped to the right, I stepped to the left, climbed a few imaginary stairs, then settled into an imaginary seat. I stared out as if taking in a view, shut my eyes, then popped them open as though waking from a deep sleep. I stood up and walked across the room, looked at the ceiling, floor, and walls, and gave a nod to signal that I was done. Someone guessed I was going to the dentist. Another thought I was on a ride at Disneyland. I shook my head, annoyed that no one could get it right. I acted it out a second time, a third time. Everyone was stumped. Mrs. Wade, my teacher said, just tell us the answer. I looked at the class. I'm in the Philippines, I said, and I'm getting on an airplane and I'm flying to the United States. Then I took my seat, frustrated that no one had understood what I'd meant when it was all so obvious and clear. I had no idea what I was talking about. I was 7 months old when we left the Philippines for America. All I know from that day is what I've been told by my parents and siblings, that our relatives saw us off at the airport and wept, that my grandmother asked my parents to leave me behind with her so that she could keep at least one of her grandchildren. We flew from Manila, had a long layover in Tokyo, arrived in San Francisco. My father was in the US Navy, but the military housing promised to us wasn't ready. So we spent our first days in the Navy Lodge in a room with 2 double beds and a small black and white TV mounted so high on the wall, no one could reach it. I was an infant then, but I'm convinced that I have one perfectly clear memory from that time. A bird swoops into the room, darting wall to wall like a ricocheting bullet, barely grazing the edge of my sister's face. A few years ago, I asked her about it. When we arrived, I said, those first few days, did a bird fly into the room? My sister, who's 15 years older than me, looked puzzled, almost skeptical. You remember that, she said. I've always been told, you had it easy. It's true. Unlike my parents and siblings, there was no new language for me to learn, no old one to keep. English is all I've ever had. The loved ones we left behind, I never really knew. I couldn't truly miss them. Even the food I craved was all American. One of the first words I ever spoke, apparently, was McDonald's. And the question of home had only one answer. Here, as in now, as in America. Despite 3 trips to the Philippines when I was 7, 27, then 40, they were always visits. But for my family, it was different. For them, those trips were returns. The part of my life that inspires my work is the part I don't remember. Those first days and weeks in America, the few years after. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm convinced that period could somehow explain everything that's happened ever since, be the true reason for every good or bad decision I've ever made, help explain whatever I've won or lost. Departure and arrival, letting go and holding on. They define, to some extent, every immigrant story, mine included. And yet, I can't really tell it. I can't write it either. At readings, I'm sometimes asked if my stories are true, if they really happened to me, if they're based on my life. They're not. But my work is emotionally autobiographical. The characters grapple with tensions familiar to me, to those closest to me. They struggle between familial history and individual destiny, seek out personal victories amidst so much loss, fight to be who they are against forces that demand they be someone else. And for most of my characters, these conflicts stem from leaving home, from crossing over from one country to another. An act of bravery, fear, genius, stupidity, defiance, compliance, regret, hope. An act I committed yet cannot recall. The best I can do is make it up, write it as fiction, act it out as pantomime. So hopefully that gives you some sense of my obsession at work and how it gets me to what I write and the books that I've at this point put out in the world. Monstress took me, I'm not proud of this fact, about 10 years to write. I'm a very, very slow writer. But once it did come out in 2012, it changed my life in significant ways. One of those ways was that it allowed me to travel abroad in ways that I hadn't before. Yeah, with the release of Monstress, I got to do readings, book festivals, residencies abroad. And while I was out there, I began meeting other Filipinos out in the world, working abroad. And some examples, in Ireland, I met Filipino nurses who had just arrived in Cork. I met caregivers and restaurant owners in Jordan. I met lead singers of cover bands working resorts along the Dead Sea. In Italy, I met a live-in nanny who lived in a 7th century castle, and I met domestic workers who earned extra money by entering local beauty pageants in Rome. And I just because I think this is so cool, I have to share this photo. So I was living in Rome for an academic year. And I understand beauty pageants, of course, are problematic, but beauty pageants are a big part of the culture in the Philippines. And I remember I somehow got invited to this pageant, the theme of which was married Filipino women over the age of 35. Those were the contestants. And one of the competitions was to create a kind of national costume using recycled materials. So here, these costumes are made of like plastic bags, plastic utensils, I think even like cigarette boxes. I think what was so impressive to me and really quite moving about this event was the way these domestic workers in Italy who have very difficult lives still can make their own community and celebrate themselves in this very public way. And to be able to witness that was just a really incredible experience. While abroad, I also had the chance to meet cousins that I'd never met before. I met a cousin who was teaching English in Bangkok. I met a cousin who was a live-in maid in Milan. So the years after the publication of my first book really allowed me to understand, or rather, I should say, have a glimpse of what Filipino life is like outside the Philippines and outside the United States. These meetings and encounters were eye-opening and humbling, and admittedly, they revealed my own ignorance about the Filipino reality. Up until that point, so much of my view about Filipino life, Filipino-ness, was really defined by America and the Philippines. But having the chance to visit all these different countries expanded my perception of Filipino-ness and also made clear to me how prevalent the global presence of Filipinos really is and the crucial roles they play in their host countries. These individuals that I met are part of a larger group, what's commonly known as, Claudia mentioned earlier, as OFWs, Overseas Filipino Workers. It's a term that's been more commonly used since the 1990s, when the Philippines Overseas Employment Administration equated the term migrant worker with overseas Filipino worker. But really, the OFW phenomenon has been happening well over a century. In fact, the earliest documentation of OFWs in North America dates back to the early 1800s, when Filipino sailors known as the Manila Men left the galleons and created their own settlement in Louisiana, a settlement called St. Malo. If you go to Louisiana, unfortunately, that settlement no longer exists. It was destroyed decades ago in a hurricane, but you'll see a plaque dedicated to St. Malo and honoring the Manila Men, who many believe are the first North American OFWs to have made a life here. I want to share just some statistics. So OFW, Overseas Filipino Worker. As of 2020, there are approximately 2.2 million OFWs across the world. They bring in the equivalent of $31.4 billion to the Philippines GDP. That's about 9%. If you look at this chart here, clearly OFWs work in all sorts of industries and have all sorts of professions. You see managers, medical workers, entertainers. etc. But the vast majority, in this graph here, 39.6%, the vast majority work in what the Philippines calls elementary occupations. And by that, they mean domestic workers, maids, construction workers, caregivers. Really, it's really the backbreaking labor of their host countries. That's the primary work that they do. Let's see. So clearly, there is a tremendous professional and financial advantage in working abroad and becoming an OFW. The reality is, though, of course, that many of these OFWs face tremendous hardships and challenges. Seeking employment abroad, again, is a huge financial opportunity, but some of the hardships that they face, for example, in countries where OFWs have limited legal rights, such as in Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia, where there is no legal maximum number of hours that they work per day, and where domestic workers are required by law to live with their employers, OFWs, women in particular, are susceptible to situations akin to modern day slavery, and they suffer emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Really, one can look at the news almost on a daily basis and find stories about OFW women in these countries facing this kind of treatment. Shamefully, this kind of this phenomenon also happens in the United States. An example, in the early 2000s, 350 Filipino teachers were recruited by the United Placement International Teaching Agency to teach in Louisiana public schools, but upon arrival were charged unaffordably high placement fees with high interest rates. Unable to pay them back, the teachers had their passports and visas confiscated and were forced to continue teaching and paid sub-minimum wages. This was essentially a case of teacher trafficking, resulting in a 2010 lawsuit where teachers were ultimately compensated only $2,200. So OFWs, and indeed the Philippines itself, faces an existential crisis with the OFW phenomenon. For all the possible financial benefits that OFWs bring to the Philippines, it has created generations of fractured families, of parents leaving behind their children in the care of elderly grandparents, older siblings, and extended family. I've met OFWs who haven't seen their children in 3 to 5 years. I've met older OFWs who have never met their grandchildren and frankly don't expect to. All of this is further complicated by the national rhetoric about OFWs. Presidents from Corazon Aquino to Rodrigo Duterte have called OFWs national heroes, essential to the country's economy. This is certainly true, but this identity of worker as hero is also at odds with the reality that OFWs are also seen, as Philippine scholar Victoria Garcia has written, as global servants. The valor of their work at odds with the limited, often debilitating ways OFWs are viewed in their host countries. Despite my research, I want to be clear, I am not a sociologist or economist or any kind of policymaker. The situation for OFWs is incredibly challenging and fraught, and I possess neither the expertise nor experience to offer practical solutions. But as a fiction writer, researching and writing about this subject, my objective and really my hope is to explore the narrative, emotional, and thematic possibilities of the OFW experience, and subsequently help bring attention to this vital population. And in that process, I'm trying to investigate a larger question in my work. What does it mean to be Filipino, not just in America, but in the world? And that brings me to my Radcliffe project, The Children Go. Oh, just briefly, I realized I just forgot a slide. I think I mentioned earlier that OFWs primarily work throughout Asia and the Middle East. Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia have two of the highest populations of OFWs. But just to illustrate how global a phenomenon this is, I just wanted to give you a sense of where OFWs are actually finding work, and they really are spread out over the continents, as you can see here. And though there is no illustration for it, you can also find OFWs in the Antarctic as well. There are OFWs who do service work at research stations, and the domestic workers who work on the Arctic cruise liners spend a lot of time on, like, Norwegian cruise liners, spend a lot of time going through the Antarctic as well. So that brings me to my Radcliffe project, The Children Go. As Claudia mentioned, it's a novel about an elderly woman named Faustina Go, whose 7 grown children are spread over 7 continents. Right now, the novel is still in its early stages. I've been able to do research here, which has been invaluable. I've had the assistance of a research assistant, Jaramel Lara. I don't know if he's out there, but if he is out there, thank you for your help. He's been elemental in helping me gather information about the different kinds of work that OFWs do across 7 continents and across dozens of different industries. One of the things that I am working on with this book, which is also a departure from my earlier work, is I'm trying to experiment with form. Both my collection of stories and my novel are fairly traditional in the ways that narrative is rendered. But I'm hoping to, as a way of reflecting the different kinds of work that OFWs do, I'm hoping to tell stories in the form of work logs, job interviews, even classroom syllabi. So this time here at Radcliffe has not only been a time of research and thought, but it's been a time where I could take artistic risks that I normally wouldn't take. So I'm really, really grateful to have had this time. I mentioned earlier, and Claudia mentioned earlier, that the book really, seeks to explore this question of what Filipino-ness means on a global scale. But I'm also interested in this idea of how one's labor can potentially define one's identity. This question of labor as identity is something that OFWs face. I remember in my time in Italy, I quickly learned that the term Filipina was synonymous with the term maid. And in fact, talking to an arts administrator, an American arts administrator, no less, he had said something along the lines of, "Oh yes, I also have a Filipina." And I was just really, just greatly disturbed that the work one does is equated to who one is. And I'm interested in exploring the complexities and the problematic realities of that kind of perception. The novel is still in its early stages, and there is a tremendous amount of work ahead. But I'm incredibly grateful to the Radcliffe Institute for providing the time, support, and community to help me get started on this project. And the time here is a springboard for the years of work to come, and I'm so grateful for it. I have about 10 minutes left, so what I thought I would do is just read a little bit from my novel, The Son of Good Fortune. This novel came out in 2020. I'd worked on the book for about 8-9 years. And of course, it came out just in time for the pandemic to hit. Obviously, there are much bigger problems in the world than my book coming out at the time of pandemic. But nonetheless, it was a bummer not to be able to do events and meet readers. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity now to read a little bit from the novel. And I thank you for listening. As Claudia said, the novel is about a 19-year-old kid named Excel. He's Filipino and undocumented, and his kind of fraught relationship with his mother, Maxima. They live in a town called Colma, which is right outside San Francisco. And Maxima, for various reasons, as I said, they're undocumented, but for various reasons, she has chosen to take on different kinds of work in order to make money and to get by. I'm going to read the prologue, and hopefully this gives you a sense of what Maxima does in order to make a livelihood for herself and to provide for her son, Excel. So this is the prologue for The Son of Good Fortune. Maxima in the dark, Half lit by a Virgin Mary nightlight and the glow of a screensaver, a slow motion sweep of stars and planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Earth. Dressed in denim cutoffs and a Mickey Mouse t-shirt, she doesn't shiver, despite her wide open bedroom window and the cold night beyond. She sits at the foot of her bed, cleaning her nails with the tip of a switchblade. May bakas ka bang nakikita sa aking muka, she sings. Like all her favorite Filipino love songs, this one is about heartbreak. An alarm goes off. The clock glows red, 10:10 p.m. She closes the switchblade. She stands and stretches, takes quick jabs at the air. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, then flips on the desk lamp and sits, turns on the ball-shaped webcam atop her monitor. A tap to the spacebar and the galaxy vanishes. Now her face fills the screen. Using it as a mirror, she puts on maroon lipstick and dabs with a Kleenex, smiles wide to check her teeth. She undoes her ponytail and shakes out her hair, a long black wave, then turns her face from side to side, searching for her best angle. She could easily pass for 30, but is somewhere in her 50s. Her true age, she swears, is a mystery, even to herself. Her parents, long since dead, kept no birth certificate. The grandmother who took her in never bothered to learn her actual birthday. Eyes closed and fingertips on the keyboard, she whispers to herself so softly that a person standing next to her would have no hope of knowing what she says. She takes a deep and slow breath, opens her eyes, types and clicks until another browser window opens. There's a man on the screen. My love, he says. No, she says, in Tagalog. Sorry, he says. Hello, mahal. That's better, she says, and blows him a kiss. Oh, Mahal, he says, please don't tease. It's been a lousy few days. She leans into the screen. Ano ba? What happened, Henry? Oh, where to start, he says. He removes his glasses, pours a shot of Jack Daniels into a coffee mug, and recounts his terrible week. More layoffs at the plant, and all the guys blame him. His ex-wife trashed the Miami timeshare but won't pay for repairs. And just today, an invitation to his high school reunion, my freaking 40th, he says, arrived in the mail. But the real downer, he says, is the weather. End of spring, and I'm still shoveling snow. Snow, snow, snowy, snowy, snow, she sings in a made-up tune. She puts her elbows on the desk, rests her chin on clasped hands. My whole life, I never see snow. Come to America, he says. Come to North Dakota. One day, she says, if God is good. God is always good, he says. Come closer. I want your face to fill the screen. Maxima leans into the webcam, so close she could almost kiss it. He says she is the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. These past 3 weeks of talking online, he says, are the best he's had in years. A twice divorced balding white guy on the edge of 60 doesn't hope for much, but when he found her profile on goodcatholicfilipinas.com and saw that her favorite food was sweet and sour chicken, that her favorite singer was Shania Twain, and that her lifelong dream was to live in joy with a good man in God's country, he convinced himself to send her a message. I know it's silly to reminisce, he says, but life before you seems so long ago. I didn't realize how lonely I was. I was lonely too, she says. And I think that maybe, he says, well, probably that I might be falling in love with you. Maxima pulls away from the screen. Oh, I'm sorry, he says. Too much too soon? She shakes her head. Not too soon, Mahal. I think maybe that I am falling in love too. With me, he says. She laughs. Yes, with you, tanga. Tanga? It means stupid, she says. He lets out a breath, slaps his chest twice. My heart, he says, it's racing. Heart, she says, in Tagalog, puso. Puso, he says, writing the word down. That means heart. Okay, got it. Soon, she says, you speak Tagalog. Then you can visit me in the Philippines, diba? Or you visit me first, he says. Maybe you can be my date to the reunion? He sets the scene. He enters his high school gym to the tune of his old prom song, We've Only Just Begun by the Carpenters. And though he hasn't aged as well as his classmates, there's no question that he is the sexiest, most gorgeous woman in the room on his arm. And the whole night, he says, you and I just dance. He leans into his webcam. His whole head seems to inflate on Maxima's screen. When can we meet, he says. Philippines to America, she sighs. Not so easy trip. The lines in Manila for passports and visas take hours, she explains, sometimes days, and never mind the near zero chances of government approval. Their best hope for being together is to pray, to keep faith in God, and to wait. And when I come to North Dakota, she says, will you show me the snow? Count on it, he says. Okay, she says, but one condition only, I don't shovel. He laughs, which makes her laugh harder and harder until she's hunched over, her laughter becoming a gasp for air. Mahal, he says, are you okay? She shakes her head, takes a breath, and says it's nothing, then keels over again. It's definitely not nothing, he says. What's wrong? Maxima looks at the camera. I'm hurt, she says. Hurt? Hurt where? She clears her throat and takes a breath. Don't worry, Henry. It's nothing, okay? Stop saying that, he says. Just tell me. Maxima looks at him for a moment, as though wondering if he can be trusted with something as private as pain. If that's what you want, Mahal, she says, standing up slowly, then okay. She lifts her shirt, adjusting the camera to make sure that he sees, then turns a slow circle to reveal a wound, a crusty gash that spans from the top of her hip to the middle of her abdomen. She explains, it happened in the typhoon 2 months before. A snap of bamboo, sharp as a spear, sliced across her body in the high-velocity winds. I lost so much blood, she says, but I'm thinking, okay, Lang, it's just a cut, bahala na. Pero now, I have an infection. Her own grandmother, she tells him, died from an infected cut, but God's good grace will keep her alive, she's sure of it. She lowers her shirt and sits, but every day, she says, it hurts. What can I do, Henry says, how can I help? He slumps in his chair. Oh, I hate this. I hate being so far from you. Before Maxima can speak, he says that maybe the day to meet should come sooner than later. What if this is God? What if this is the universe telling them that he should be the one to fly to her? And, well, depending on the current round-trip airfare from Grand Forks to Manila, maybe now is the time to come together. But Maxima says no and promises him that there's a better day ahead for them to meet, one when she's healthy and strong. For now, all she needs are his love, his faith, and prayers, nothing else. But there is one thing, she says. Tell me, he says. Medicine, she says. Ointments and creams and all the antibiotics. The best hospital in Manila has all those things, pero she bites her lip, fighting tears. Walang pera. Walang pera, he says. No money, she shakes her head. There's never any money. Henry puts his glasses back on. Well, he says, how much do you need? Bahala na, Mahal, it's okay, please don't worry. How much, he says, tell me. No, I can't accept. She swivels her chair away from the screen. I'm so ashamed. Just tell me, he says, please. She takes a breath. 22,000 pesos. Pesos? How much is that? $400, she says, USD. Half the money is for the doctor. The other half is for the medicine, she says. In the Philippines, if you have no insurance, medical care is very expensive. It's almost impossible talaga. It's not like in the States. She dabs her eyes with her pinky and, with her other hand safely out of camera view, reaches for the switchblade next to her computer. She flicks it open and twirls it between her fingers, a thing she does when she's anxious or uncertain, or when the inevitable is on the edge of finally happening. On screen, Henry is motionless, his face a blank. Mahal, she says, are you there? Finally, Henry moves. I'm here, he says. Sorry, my screen froze for a sec. Where were we? What were you saying? Money, she says, for the medicine. And how much was it? He says, 500? 5, yes, 500, she says, 500 USD. He looks toward the ceiling and blinks like he's adding up figures in his head. Let's make it 600, okay? 600? She shakes her head, says no, and starts to weep. It's too much, Mahal. It's too much. Shh, he says, a finger to his lips. There's no price on love, diba? Maxima laughs. Diba, yes, that's right. She wipes her eyes with a Kleenex, says it's almost 1 p.m. in the Philippines and time for her to go. She gives quick instructions when and how he can wire money to an online account and tells him that she'll let him know when the payment goes through. This will help me so much, so much. Thank you, Mahal. Thank you, she says. And soon, one day, I promise we will meet. Henry nods. Yes, Mahal. And when we do, we'll sit in the countryside, put on some shanaya, and then he leans into his camera, filling her screen again. We're gonna fuck like bunnies. He winks and kisses the air, and the blade spins faster in Maxima's hand. They say goodbye, and Henry signs off, disappears from the screen. But Maxima is still there, and for a moment, she watches herself, tilts her head slightly, like her face is one she recognizes but doesn't quite know. She turns off the webcam. She lifts her shirt, carefully peels away the wound, a trick of rubber and glue, then jots down quick notes in a small spiral notebook. She picks up the switchblade and opens her closet, where, on the inside of the door, she's tacked up a human target, the kind you find at a shooting range. She steps back, stands against the opposite wall. Maxima raises the blade, aims, and throws. She misses the heart, not by much. And I think I'll end there. Thank you so much for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lysley. Yeah, very moving. We do have questions. Let's start with the last one I have on my screen here. Please describe the research sources for The Son of Good Fortunes and your ongoing work.
The research sources, was that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So for The Son of Good Fortune, that was a really challenging book to research. As Claudia had mentioned, and as I think I'd explained, the book is very much about undocumented Filipinos. As someone who is not undocumented myself, I wanted to be very careful and concise with the facts of being undocumented in America, and especially being an undocumented Filipino in America. So I did extensive research on the topic. And in fact, I even included a scene where there was where Excel is watching a CNN debate, and you see these two talking heads debating the situation of undocumented immigrants. And what I was realizing was that because I felt so committed to doing all this research and to being factually accurate with the subject matter, the book started veering toward the didactic. At a certain point, much of what I was writing started feeling almost sociological and statistical. I was losing sight of the fact that despite the topic of undocumented immigration, this was still a book very much about a very particular son and his very particular mother. It's a character-driven story set against the backdrop of being undocumented. I mean, it's crucial to their character, crucial to their experience, but in early drafts, the research was overwhelming the narrative. And in fact, when my editor saw, close to a final draft, she really had me pull out a lot of those scenes where it seemed clear that I was trying to prove that I'd done my research. So while the research was absolutely essential to my understanding of the story and certainly to my understanding of the character, I actually had to pull some of that research away from the novel itself and recommit the story to one of a mother and a son.
The next question starts with, thank you for sharing your work, ! I'd love to hear you talk about your influences, literary and otherwise.
Oh God, that's a great question. Okay, literary, quite a few, but my main inspiration really is the Indian-American writer who's no longer with us, sadly, Bharati Mukherjee. So I am not one of those writers who grew up wanting to become a writer. I'd always read, but it never occurred to me to write. Late in college, I took a class on the history of the short story, basically to fulfill a graduation requirement. And I took the class with Bharati Mukherjee, who I learned was an Indian-American writer who actually wrote books that seemed very glamorous to me. So I thought, why don't I pick up one of her books? And I picked up her book, The Middleman and Other Stories, which is a story collection. And I remember reading it late one night in my freezing Oakland apartment and turning to one story and seeing a Filipino character. And I realized in that moment, this was the first time I'd ever seen a Filipino character in American fiction. And I'd been a reader all my life. It was thrilling, but simultaneously troubling that it took that long for me to encounter a character who had even just some remote semblance of my own experience. I'm American, I grew up American, felt very invested in the American reality, and yet I somehow felt denied that I'd never seen that kind of representation in American fiction. And I thought, I want to try to fix this. So that really became my motivation to start writing. And I took classes with her and and she really did become a mentor. And so her work has meant so much to me. I'm actually, they're releasing a collected stories for Bharati Mukherjee, and I'm actually writing the afterword, which I'm a little nervous about. So I'm really hoping to do her justice. In terms of non-literary influences, the first that comes to mind, and I actually did mention them in the prologue, is kind of embarrassed to say this, the Carpenters. The reason I'm saying the Carpenters, for those who remember the brother-sister pop duo, I grew up listening to the Carpenters. We loved them. Filipinos love the Carpenters. I know I'm running the risk of stereotyping, but it's true. There is a particular song of theirs called Top of the World, which is very fun and bouncy and kind of cheesy. But if you slow down the song, there is this line where Karen Carpenter sings, she says, tomorrow will be just the same for you and me. And it's the way she says the word, or rather sings the word same. There, of course, Karen Carpenter's story is a very tragic one. When she sings the word same, you hear this terrible, sad longing and ache in her voice, but it's against the backdrop of this kind of buoyant, almost cheesy melody. I remember listening to that once when I was in grad school. I don't know what I was doing, but I just kept listening to it over and over. And I thought, I think this is what I'm trying to do with my work. I'm really drawn to the kind of whimsy and bizarreness and maybe even buoyancy of surface level plot. A lot of the stories in Monstress are kind of strange, but I'm more interested in that kind of ache underneath. If I have an aesthetic at all, I think it's inspired by that moment that Karen Carpenter sings. Anyway, so I would say that's a non-literary influence.
Right. So let's stay on your writing practice. And the next question is, this excerpt was so good, exclamation mark. Can you talk about how you get into the emotional space to write a story?
Oh, that's another good question. I think one of the ways I get to the emotional space of a character or the emotional space of a story is to really think about my point of view character. When I'm stuck, I often will just get out of my house, go for a walk. And what I force myself to do, if I'm very much in writing mode, I'll force myself to go for a walk, but try to stay in the point of view of whatever character I'm working with. And I ask myself, if I am walking down 10th Avenue in San Francisco, what would that character notice that no other character would notice? So it's really all about perception. And I tell my students, you can never undervalue this question of what a character notices, questions, editorializes as they are moving through the world. I think trying to occupy the headspace of a character is a way of accessing their own emotional lives. One's emotional experience really colors the way one perceives something, even if they're not feeling that emotion in the moment. So that's the only way I know how to create a kind of emotional space or an emotional reality on the page.
The next question asks, how has your writing found any readers in the Philippines, which I'm sure it has, and how had they reacted to it?
Yeah, it's funny, when I first started writing and I published, stories here and there was a Filipino critic, I don't remember who it was, mentioned me in an article and said that I would never have an audience in the Philippines because my work was just too American. And I was fine with that. What did I know? But I have been fortunate to find an audience in the Philippines. I was invited to do a reading back there about 10 years ago. And the response was really positive and really supportive. And I continue to hear from Filipino readers. I've done Zoom visits to Filipino classrooms. So I think to have their readership is especially meaningful to me because I am an American writer. My experience in this world is very much rooted in my experience as an American. So there are times where I feel a little nervous knowing that my work might be read in the Philippines because it's set there and because I am writing about Filipinos. I'm hoping that that the work strikes emotionally and psychologically believable notes. So anytime I have a Filipino reader who says something supportive about the work, I'm very honored by that.
Appreciate it, of course, yeah. Thank you so much! Exclamation mark! Another appreciation of your talk. Can you say something about how your family sees your work?
Oh, wow. I think they're watching right now. What if they asked that?
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful.
You know, my mother, you know, my mother didn't go very far in her education. She essentially stopped going to school regularly after sixth grade. I think she was able to go back here and there. You know, her life was challenging. So even though she could speak English and could communicate, reading English was very difficult for her, and she would not have really been able to read the book. But I remember when the book finally came out, she picked up the book my sister took her to Barnes and Noble, and she saw the book and she picked up the book and cried and kissed it. So I like to say, I don't want to get choked up here. I like to say that my mother loved the book that she couldn't read. In many ways, that is the ultimate kind of support for me. My family and my family members have read the book, or and you know, the novel, and they are extremely supportive. You know, they possess a very different kind of genius than me. They're hardworking and work really just kind of these kinds of professional jobs that I would never be able to figure out myself. So what I do is quite different from what they do, but nonetheless, they appreciate it and they have read it, and they show up to all the Zoom readings, all the events that I do. So their support is, you know, it's just absolute, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, and I would like to say to the Tenorio family, they're there, obviously. Hello, everybody. So your first two books, Monstress and The Son of Good Fortune, are both set primarily in the United States. How do you think the various settings in your next book, which will be set on all 7 continents, influence the work itself?
Right. You know, this is, you know, one of the main reasons that being at Radcliffe has been so important. Just the chance to dive deep into the different stories of OFW populations in different countries has given me the chance to, you know, do research on the countries themselves. I'm finding that I'm needing to do research on particular kinds of landscapes, particular kinds of weather systems, just to get a sense for what the backdrop of these stories set in so many different countries all over the world, what they could do for the particular narratives, what they could do for the characters who might occupy that space. I never thought I would dive deep into trying to understand what neutrinos are and how they function in Antarctica, but I'm having to do that kind of work, which is challenging and interesting, but it's using a different part of my brain that I didn't really have to use for the first 2 books. Again, the book is still in its early stages, but as I accumulate all this research and sift through all I've gathered, it's opening up not only the narrative possibilities, but as I'd mentioned earlier, even the possibilities of form. This will be a very different kind of book for me, and I imagine many challenges ahead, and I'm hoping I can meet those challenges.
That's great. And then a question from someone who may be writing a book but struggling a little bit. So the first comment is, "This talk was wonderful!" Exclamation mark. I'd love to hear more about your daily writing practice. Do you have advice about how to motivate yourself to sit down and write?
Daily writing practice, you flatter me. I wish it were daily, man. You know, I said earlier, the first book took about 10 years to write, and the second book took like 8 or 9 years. I'm not the kind of writer who has a daily practice. Certainly I'm thinking about writing all the time, but that doesn't mean I actually get to the page every single day. You know, I'm a writer who very much has to negotiate the day-to-day mundane routines, or you know, even maybe some not, you know, out of the ordinary situations with my writing. They all kind of compete with each other. So writing is something that occupies my brain, but doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing every single day. That said, when I really am in the thick of it, I'm in the stages of revision or getting ready to send something off, I'm really hard at work. That's when I am getting up 5, 6 in the morning and pretty much staying up at my computer throughout the day and into the night. I have become very reliant on opportunities like the Radcliffe Fellowship to really devote my time and block out everything else. So this past year has been a time of writing, of course, but also of reading and research. But the day-to-day practice, I haven't quite figured that out. And I may just have to resign myself to the fact that I never will.
Excellent. There seems to be a lot of interest in your research process and how it fits into your writing afterwards. So how does your research factor into your work? Does it inspire, perhaps even direct the trajectory of your stories?
It does both. It does both. With Monstress, for example, a lot of those stories are based on what I call strange but true facts or situations. Like, for example, there's a story in there about the time the Beatles were in the Philippines and were beat up by Marcos loyalists before they boarded their plane. Supposedly, the Beatles said something lewd about Imelda Marcos, and so they were attacked by these Filipino Marcos loyalists. If you watch the Beatles documentary, they actually say, "I hated the Philippines," and that they will never go back again, and they never did. I did not know about that incident until I happened to be flipping through a biography of Ferdinand Marcos once. When I saw that very small detail, which was mentioned in like 2 sentences, I immediately thought, here's a bit of research that I could spin into a story. And the reason I felt like I could was because it resonated with the particular tensions that I'm interested in, the Philippines and America, or in that case, the Philippines and the West, literally coming head to head. So my eye is trained for any kind of research that resonates with that particular kind of tension. So sometimes my research can actually determine or dictate what I write about. Other times, like with The Son of Good Fortune, story and character came first. I needed the research to supplement that book, but it can happen the other way around as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lysley. Thank you so much for your moving presentation and for your thoughtful perspectives. I also want to thank our audience for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe programs. You can find out more about programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.